Mics are coming. In the meantime, I will kick us off while the Senator and Jim Brett, CEO of the New England Council, get mic'd up. My name is Humberto Speranza. Thanks, everyone, for joining us on UNUM's campus this morning for a special conversation with Senator Angus King. There's no one better at this moment in time, I think, to provide us the insights across a host of issues. First and foremost, thank you to the New England Council, Jim Brett, CEO, Larry, team. UNUM is a proud member of the New England Council. I sit on its board, and we are very lucky to be able to host this event 2 years in a row. Just a little bit has happened since you were here last year, Senator, so we're going to dive into all of that. First and foremost, a resounding re-election victory for Senator King in November. Senator King continues to sit and represent Maine on Armed Services, Intelligence, Energy and Natural Resources, and Veterans Affairs. Big issues, but I know there's a couple more issues that we'll likely want to bring up as well that the Senator is ready to talk about. At UNUM, our purpose is to help the working world thrive through life's moments. One way we do that is giving back to our community. So I did want to ask my colleague Jennifer McGrath quickly to come up to give a special message to the Senator, and thank you as well to all of the UNUM senior leaders and colleagues that are in the room today. But Jennifer, over to you, and then Jim, we'll pass it to you to get things started.
Is that on? That's on. I guess it is.
Thank you, Humberto.
Okay.
On behalf of We Serve, which is a employee network here serving our veterans and families of those who serve, we have a challenge coin. And you may be aware that a challenge coin is a long-standing military tradition with the insignias, with the organization's insignia, and is used to show a sign of appreciation or exemplary service. It is meant to be a tangible reminder of our appreciation and respect. So it's my great honor to present one to you, Senator King, on behalf of UNUM and the We Serve for all that you do for our veterans in protecting their benefits.
Thank you. I'm going to stand.
Sure. Okay. Stand.
I'm going to stand because when I sit, I can't see you. And is that okay?
All
right.
I guess I'll stand. What did Ed Markey say when he first ran for office? You can't tell me how to vote, but you can tell me how to stand. So,
well, I thought you were going to say I've worked with more dead mics than an Irish undertaker.
First of all, I just want to say good morning, everyone, and I want to thank UNUM and Humberto for opening up his magnificent room here to the New England Council. It's our second year in a row that we have been hosting the distinguished senator here, and we thank the staff here, which is extraordinary. They make it enjoyable, pleasant experience for all of us at the New England Council. So I would just want to get into a few items of the New England Council, and then we'll get into the questions with the senator. In the coming weeks, we'll be doing an event like this in New Hampshire with Maggie Hassan, and then a couple of weeks after that, we'll be doing an event like this in Providence with Senator Jack Reed. And anyone that's interested in what we're doing in Washington, we'll have events down there with Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts, and Lori Trahan, also of Massachusetts, will be speaking in Washington. And speaking of D.C., we just opened our registration in 2025 Washington Conference, which is a 2-day event, which 275 people from all 6 New England states come down every single year to network, to learn more about what is going on in Washington, and to meet not only senators from here, but all of the senators, all the congressmen from New England. It's a great event, and then we also have opportunities to meet with members of Congress and members of the Senate outside of New England. We have a media panel luncheon update, what is going on in Washington. It's just terrific 2 days of really learning what is going on in Washington, to say the least. So, and as some of you may know, the New England Council is 100 years old this year, and hard to believe. And the origin of the New England Council began in Poland Spring.
Wow.
back in 1925. Governors met with the CEOs of the leading industries, which are manufacturing, textile, shoe industry, and they talked about mass exodus of employees, workers, leaving New England, going down south to the Carolinas, warmer climate, lower taxes, and how do we work together as a region? And the senator here would say, well, you know, we get along with our employers here, and they know us, and the employer would say, yeah, that's good, but shoes that are made here, our customers are in Connecticut. And then all of a sudden, the jeweler in Rhode Island says, geez, my customers are in Portland and they're in Manchester, New Hampshire. But the roads are not very good, going up and down. And all of a sudden, they started putting together a New England Council agenda, transportation, infrastructure. Then they started talking about cost of heating, the manufacturing plants, and all of a sudden, you know, heat, and then all of a sudden, it's regional airports. So, and then maybe something on taxes as well, regional. So the genesis was if we work together as a region, we're much stronger. And now more than ever, we're only 5.5% of the nation's population, but we have 12% of the United States Senate here in New England, which is a powerful tool, to say the least. And what the New England Council does is work with each and every senator as well as members of Congress, working together as a region, because when we work together, we're united, we're stronger. The senator understands that better than most people, and that's why I think he's so well respected, but also so effective in what he does. Into the commercial New England Council. Now we get into the questions. I don't know how many people watched 60 Minutes last night. Senator, a great job, to say the least. And I guess that was my first question, Senator. What is your reaction to the clash of two presidents Friday afternoon, and how do you think the damage can be repaired?
Thanks, Jim. First, thanks to the New England Council. It's always fun to get together both here and in Washington when we have a lot of people down. I want to apologize for not having a jacket on. I don't mean to be disrespectful. I literally don't have a suit in Maine. All of my suits are in Washington. I did post on Instagram yesterday, I don't know if you saw it, a picture of Winston Churchill at the White House in 1942 in fatigues. My caption was, "Wartime leader visits White House 1942, just saying." So anyway. First, a quick funny story about 60 Minutes. My interview with 60 Minutes took place on Thursday and lasted 40 minutes. What you saw last night was about 40 seconds. What happened was, of course, Tuesday sort of scooped us. The purpose of the segment was to have a long, thoughtful piece about Ukraine and the war and foreign policy and why it was important and those kinds of things. And so I had a lot more to say than you saw last night, but then Friday afternoon happened, and obviously that was where the focus of the program went. In answer to your question, Jim, I've watched that White House situation 4 or 5 times. Interestingly, it started, the clip you've seen was about the last 5 or 6 minutes of a 49-minute piece. And the first 40 minutes were basically a kind of amiable conversation about agreement, and the president was complimentary to Zelensky for the bravery of the Ukrainian people. I mean, it just went on and on. And then all of a sudden, and it was very interesting, the president looked at the camera and said, "One more question." And that's when J.D. Vance interrupted and sort of the whole thing went to pieces. It almost seemed like it was on purpose. And then, of course, came this sort of piling on. And after watching it 3 or 4 times and reading some of the things about Zelensky as disrespectful, he didn't say a single word that was disrespectful. Not one word. What he tried to explain was that a deal with Putin that doesn't have security guarantees isn't worth the paper it's written on, which he knew from personal experience. He had signed ceasefire agreements with Putin, which had been just ignored. And of course, there was in the 80s when in the 80s, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons at the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there was an explicit agreement to respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine in exchange for them giving up their nuclear weapons, signed by Russia and the United States. Well, we know what happened with that. So the idea that he was being somehow disrespectful, and here's my theory, and we will see how it plays out in the next week or two. I believe that what happened in the White House was creating a pretext for cutting off all American aid to Ukraine. And we'll see what happens in the next 2 weeks, but you're seeing rumblings about Zelensky should step down, he was disrespectful, didn't respect the Oval Office. And let's see. Now, also on Friday afternoon, which didn't get much publicity, the State Department terminated the aid that was going to Ukraine to help them maintain their electric grid, which is one of the things the Russians have been attacking relentlessly to try to basically freeze the Ukrainians into submission. That happened the same day that this White House situation happened, that we cut off support, which basically we've been providing to just help them to keep the grid up and running. And when I was there, that was one of the things that we looked at was the sustainability of the electric grid. So we'll see what comes out. I won't give you everything I said on 60 Minutes that didn't make it on the air, but I will say the last part they said I thought it would be the greatest geopolitical mistake this country's made since World War II. Why? It will embolden dictators and dispirit allies. It will, appeasement of dictators doesn't work. We know that. And I got into a little contretemps with a fellow on the street in Bath a while ago, and he said, well, Putin only wants, Ukraine. He doesn't want anything, nothing else. I said, then why did the Finns and Sweden suddenly decide to join NATO? They know Putin and Russia better than we do. And after 70 years, they suddenly said, wow, I think we better join NATO. And Putin has basically said he wants to reestablish the Soviet Union. That includes the Baltics, Poland, Hungary. And so Maya Angelou once said, if somebody tells you who they are, you should believe them. And that's what we're faced with. So, and also, the other person watching this is Xi Jinping with regard to Taiwan. And if Xi Jinping says, well, the Americans won't stick, they're really not very good allies, it seems to me that clearly is an incentive, or at least the absence of a disincentive for him to try to take Taiwan. And of course, Kim Jong-un, same thing with South Korea. So embolden dictators and dispirit allies. I've learned this in 12 years on the Armed Services and Intelligence Committees. Our asymmetric advantage in the world is allies. We have allies all over the world. China has customers. We have allies. I've been to the Pacific and met with the smaller countries. And, they sort of have to deal with China because it's this big looming presence and particularly economic power. But we're the ones they want to be friends with. And to alienate our allies is a terrible geopolitical mistake. It's as I say, it's our biggest advantage in the world. And so to poke the eye of the Europeans, now wait a minute, how about imposing a tariff on our best friend, which borders the United States, and Maine does $6 billion a year of business with? What is the point of a tariff on Canada? There's not any. I met with the Canadian ministers last week. There's very little, if any, fentanyl coming across the border from Canada. That was the ostensible purpose. So I guess what I'm saying is that's what I meant when I said it was a huge mistake. Emboldening aggressive dictators and alienating allies. So this is a dangerous moment. And if Putin is allowed to just, President Trump kept saying a deal, you got to take a deal, you got to take a deal, but there was never any description of what the deal is. And basically, Zelensky kept saying, I just want some safeguards to be sure that the deal is respected. I thought of Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. And so that was my take on what happened on Friday. It was this thing that Zelensky was disrespectful. If you go back and watch it, and you can, he doesn't say anything disrespectful. He just says the truth. And then I thought, the president said, he's got all this hatred for Putin. He's lost 100,000 dead people in his country, tortured, murdered, kids kidnapped. I'd be a little irritated by that. So it was a very strange event. But as I said, I think it's a precursor to a cutoff of American support. And it appears that the Europeans are ready to step into the breach and not let an appeasement take place. So that's my thoughts on that.
I mean, we look at Ukraine as being an independent, democratic country. Don't you think Putin looks at Ukraine as part of Russia?
Oh, he said he doesn't think Ukraine is a real country.
Yeah.
And indeed, 500 years ago, I think Kyiv was the first capital of Russia. But it's been an independent and separate country for many years, particularly since the fall of the Soviet Union. It's a democratic system. But he doesn't believe it's a real country. He thinks the Ukrainians are really they're Russians at heart. If there was any sympathy for Russia in Ukraine, I think it's gone now after the events of the last 3 years. By the way, Russia invaded Ukraine, just so you know.
Well, there was a resolution offered in the United Nations saying that Russia invaded
Which we
Ukraine,
voted against.
and the people who voted against that resolution was the United States,
China, and
Russia, North Korea, and
Yeah, I've read
I
the
think
resolution. It was not
Belarus.
shocking or it was just a statement of facts and a reiteration of what the sort of expectation of the certainly Western countries for 70 years. It was a restatement of just what happened. It was pretty shocking, that vote. So you combine that vote with the cutoff of aid to the Ukrainian grid, and then what happened on Friday, and I think it's pretty clear the direction that we're headed. And this isn't, one of the other things that frustrates me about this is that somehow this isn't charity. What we're giving to Ukraine is in our interest. They're doing the dying. Half the Russian army has been decimated without any bloodshed by Americans. All we've done is supply the bullets and the material in order to do that. And it's defending our interests because it's putting off a greater conflict later on. People write my office about this, and I say, Google Sudetenland, 1938. When Hitler could have been stopped fairly easily, wasn't, and the result was 55 million people killed. So it isn't charity that we're doing this. It's in our own very clear national interest. One other piece. In terms of contribution to Ukraine as a percentage of GDP, which is a sort of apples to apples comparison, we're number 12 in the world. There are 11 countries doing better than us in terms of their actual serious effort of their economy. Not surprisingly, Poland, I think, is number one, the countries that are most at risk that see it. But this idea, and by the way, latest figures, we've given $122 billion, not $350 billion. Just the data indicates 122. Europe as a whole has given 138. So I really don't understand why we're pivoting away from a democracy toward a dictatorship. but that seems to be the case, and it's a tragedy for America, not only morally and ethically, but also just, as I say, in our own country's self-interest.
Are you optimistic at all that UK and France, Ukraine seem to be working on a compromise that the White House might accept?
I hope so, and I think it's possible. I'm not sure. Well, it was clear from that exchange that the president and the vice president weren't really listening to Zelensky's argument that you can't trust Putin without guarantees, because he kept talking over Zelensky when he was trying to make that point. But maybe in a calmer moment, that will come through. That there will be some serious security guarantees. It might not be membership in NATO, if that's a red line for Putin, but some security guarantees that Putin can't just use a ceasefire to rearm and rebuild his military and come back in a year or two. That's what Zelensky's basically looking for. Now, there's been no discussion of where the real estate, which parts of the country are going to, be in which area. But I'm hoping that the British and the Europeans can come up with a plan that the United States will support. It'll be we'll just have to see what they propose. But they realize what's at stake, and I must say they're friends of mine in the Senate, both the Democrats and Republicans, particularly Republicans, who agree with basically what I've been saying, and they've been very supportive of Ukraine and realize the geopolitical implications. So I'm hoping that there'll be enough sort of pressure, if you will, on the administration to recognize that A, you don't appease dictators, and B, protecting the sovereignty of a democratic country is in our interest.
We're about 11 days away from a potential shutdown. Government just will not be able to come to an agreement, the House and the Senate, and that's March the 14th is that deadline. Do you see any type of compromise being made with your colleagues and also the colleagues across the aisle to avoid a shutdown?
It's really hard to see what's going to happen. It's very difficult. Nobody wants to have a shutdown. Nobody wants to be responsible for a shutdown. On the other hand, here's the dynamic as I see it. The Republicans believe, I think rightly so, that the Democrats don't want to be responsible for a shutdown. Therefore, they don't feel that they really have to negotiate very much. That ultimately the Democrats will vote for whatever will keep the government open. And therefore, the question is what's going to be in the bill. The president the other day called for a year-long continuing resolution, basically no budget between now and next September when the new budget is due. The problem with that is that it sort of freezes everything in place, and nothing new can happen in your funding programs that aren't really there. Plus, if you stop and think about it, basically that's eliminated the congressional power of the purse. It basically says there's no point in having an appropriations committee or appropriations process because we're just not going to do it. It's just not it completely undermines the responsibility and power of Congress to control expenditures. So I'm guessing that what we'll see is another short-term continuing resolution for maybe a month. But I keep saying, I've been saying ever since I got there, I don't get it. We're not going to know anything on April 14th that we don't know on March 14th. Why don't we just do a budget? And by the way, the Appropriations Committee in the Senate, I think in last August or September, did the whole budget. Passed all 12 bills, I believe, out of the committee, almost entirely on a bipartisan basis. Many of them were unanimous, the 12 bills being the various sectors of the government. So it's there, and then of course you've got the House, and I don't know what they're doing. But I think The Democrats are going to try to negotiate some safeguards into this continuing resolution that, in fact, recognize the constitutional authority of Congress to control the expenditures. But how that's going to play out, given the fact that I think I'm just being honest, I think it's going to be difficult for the Democrats to say we're going to shut down the government if you don't give us what we want. But that's the dynamic, Jim, that's unfolding.
The president would like to see his tax cuts from 2017. I think in the Senate allows it to continue for the next 10 years, and then in the House it's made permanent. But it's over $4 trillion of a tax cut across the board.
No, Jim, no, you're wrong.
Really?
You're wrong.
Tell me where I'm wrong.
The administration and the Republicans are now taking the position that extending the tax cuts that expire this year really have no cost. I'm serious about this. They're arguing that it's a continuation of policy, therefore it's really not it's not a change. So they're arguing that it should be scored as 0 instead of $4.5 trillion. That's a bit of discussion that's going on. That just came up last week. All of you in business would love to do your accounting that way. But I was just teasing you. But that's what they're saying. And the question is, to what extent will, by the way, there was no pay for the 2017 tax cut, 0. So the loss of revenues there went right into the deficit. Nobody knows how they're going to try to pay for this. Let me share a bit of thought about the budget. If you go back about 50 years and look at what they call discretionary domestic spending, which is what we think of, the Department of Interior and the Department of Justice and National Parks and Agriculture, all of those kinds of programs were 4% of GDP 50 years ago, and they're 4% of GDP today. In other words, it's just flat. Now, there were some blips during pandemic when there was spending to sort of keep the economy afloat, but basically 4% right along. Defense, discretionary, when they say discretionary, that means Congress does the appropriating, was 9% 50 years ago, 9% of GDP. Today it's right around 3%. Doesn't that surprise you? Defense spending has fallen by 2/3 as a percentage of the economy in the last 50 years. So now defense and non-defense together are 8 or 9% of GDP. So what's happened with the deficit? Two things: unfunded tax cuts and the growth of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. The Bush tax cuts in 2005, the Trump tax cuts in 2017 weren't paid for. A big hunk of the deficit was created by cutting taxes but not cutting spending. Do you see what I mean? And right now, federal revenues are about 17% of GDP. Spending is about 21% of GDP. The deficit is 4% of GDP. The difference between revenues and expenditures. Why are Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid going up? Two reasons. We're getting older and healthcare is costing more. 10,000 people a day now qualify for Medicare. 10,000 people a day are reaching the age where they qualify for Medicare. And of course, it's no secret that the baby boomers are retiring, except for me. And so the cost of Social Security are going up. By the way, every now and then someone asks me about my age. I don't know if you saw the Oscars last night. I'm a year younger than Mick Jagger, just so you know, okay? Just so you know. So that's where the bulk of the expenditures are. Now let's talk about federal employees. We've heard all this. Mary says I should call it doggy, not dodge. We've heard about all the cuts in employees. Oh, we're cutting the budget. We're going to save a lot of money. We're going to reduce the deficit. If you cut the federal employment by 10%, which is a pretty big reduction. I'm just using that as an example. That would equal 0.3% of the current federal budget. It would equal 2% of the current deficit. So the idea that you're going to close the deficit by firing federal workers is just a fantasy. I mean, you could cut them in half and do the math again, but it wouldn't be a substantial percentage. And so a lot of that is performative, very damaging performance, but it's not doing much to deal with the deficit. Not that I'm certainly not saying we shouldn't be doing efficiency and right-sizing the agencies and all those things. Some of you may remember my first year as governor, we did exactly that. We had something, instead of calling it DOGE, we called it the Productivity Realization Task Force. The difference, though, was we had members of the private sector, Lynn Bell, some of you probably remember Lynn Bell, an accountant here in town, a group of people from the private sector, legislators, and members of the administration, and we took 8 or 9 months, not 8 weeks, and we looked at every agency, and we basically found deficiencies. There were 5 field offices of Fish and Wildlife, and we reduced it to 3. It was done in a thoughtful way, looking at each position, looking at the mission of the agency, and indeed we reduced the size of Maine state government by something like 10%. But it wasn't being done randomly. Firing people who are on probation is random. It's not an analysis of how good they are, how efficiently they're performing. You could have hired the very best employee in the world last summer, and they've been fired because they're defined as on probation. And here's another wrinkle that hasn't gotten much publicity. In the federal government, if you're promoted, you're on probation again in the new position. So you can work for the government for 5 or 10 years, get promoted, and if you happen to have gotten promoted in the last year, you're on probation and you're being fired. And by the way, 30% of the federal workforce are veterans. So by extrapolation, about 1/3 of the people being fired are veterans. At Togus last week, they fired 7 people, 5 of whom were veterans. That's, I just don't think that's right. So, sorry to go on for so long, but this budget stuff is very complicated, but firing federal workers and cutting, Head Start is not going to balance the budget. And we've got to talk about revenues, and we've got to talk about efficiencies and which programs are being effective and which aren't. But right now, it's not being done in that kind of thoughtful, step-by-step way. It's being done as you know. And by the way, I really hated that picture of Elon Musk with the chainsaw. Yes. That was offensive to me. These are people's lives. This isn't a joke. These are people's lives. I was in the TSA line in Baltimore coming home on Friday and happened to start chatting with a guy in front of me, worked for the U.S. Forest Service, and part of his job was wildland firefighting. He'd just been fired that week. A young guy, and he was no analysis of how well he was doing his job or anything else. He was fired because he'd been hired a year ago. He was on probation. So. And you heard about him firing the nuclear scientists at the nuclear agency by mistake. The other piece, Elon Musk last week said, we inadvertently closed the Ebola, we made a mistake, we closed the Ebola prevention program. So we're going to put it back. Think of the implications of that. He's basically saying, I get to decide which programs we close and which programs we put back. That's not the function of Elon Musk or even the president. That's the function of Congress. And that's what I mean when I say that there's a constitutional conflict here, because the executive is basically doing what Congress is assigned to do, which is to expend funds and decide which programs. And the only obligation of the president in Article 1 is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. It doesn't say, take care that the laws you like be faithfully executed, or the ones you don't like, you don't have to execute. So you can tell I'm a little This is not good where we are.
Also, it's not allowed for the president to make laws.
No,
You do it.
that's right. And by the way, I keep saying by the way, the Constitution was designed to be clunky on purpose. The whole essence of the Constitution is the division of power. The framers of the Constitution, if you read Madison, 51st Federalists, and others, were very aware of the danger of putting all the power in one set of hands. The Romans had a question that was the whole deal. Quis custodes ipso custodiet? Who will guard the guardians? You put people in charge and give them power. How do you keep them from abusing you? Madison had a wonderful way of putting, the ladies will have to excuse me because he wasn't thinking in a very equitable way, but here's what he said. If angels were to govern,
You wouldn't have.
no government would be necessary. If angels were in charge of the government, then no checks and balances would be necessary. But then he said, but the challenge rests in this. In a government of men over men, you must show the government to have the power, but you must oblige it to control itself. And that's what the separation of powers is all about. That's why the framers put the power of making laws in the Congress, and the president's job is to execute the laws. Did you ever think about the word executive? That means carry forth. Administration means carry out. It doesn't mean make the laws. So that's what worries me. The deeper problem about what's going on here is a concentration of power in one set of hands, which inevitably leads to abuse. That's just human nature. Power corrupts, all power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So that's what's going on, as Jim suggests, when the president takes on the power of deciding we're going to destroy AID. AID was an agency created by statute. If he doesn't like AID, he's got a Republican majority in the House and the Senate. Go to the Congress and say, let's abolish AID. Or the Consumer Finance Protection Board, or the independent agencies, the SEC. They were created by Congress to be independent on purpose because they didn't want them to be subject to political manipulation. This is what's really worrying me on a kind of deeper sense is the concentration of power in one set of hands. And I don't, we're always thinking of Donald Trump, but it could be anybody. It could be Joe Biden or anybody else. You don't want a president with all that power. I said on TV the other day, people are cheering this, some people, but then the eye of Sauron is going to hit them, and they're not going to like it. It's one of the fundamental safeguards of our liberty. It's not, the framers didn't do it just to make it complicated for fun. They wanted it to be complicated because they didn't want clear all power to be in one set of hands.
You talked earlier about some of the cuts that have already been announced. Can you give some more examples of how it's going to impact Maine? I looked at some of the stats on NIH funding here in Maine. You get $118 million, and it's about 1,450 jobs.
Right.
If you listen to the administration, NIH funding is high on their list to reduce substantially. So that would be one example, I think. But
Sure.
You must hear more from your constituents.
Well, yeah, NIH is a good place to start. First, basic research is one of the things the federal government can and should do, because the private sector, we're talking risky research. In other words, that won't have an immediate payback. So the government does the deep, basic research, and then the private sector picks up and develops products and systems and all those kinds of things. Jackson Lab, I think some people here. Jackson Lab is in the crosshairs. This is a very dangerous moment for Jackson Lab because it's basically a pure research institution. It employs several thousand people in Maine. another 1,000 or so across the country. And the university is going to be impacted. Over the weekend, they canceled something called the Sea Grant program, which has been going on for 50 years, that supports marine research. 20 people have to be laid off at the University of Maine this week. And these support programs all across the coast, all the marine. I was at the Fishermen's Forum on Friday, and the word hadn't come out yet, but a lot of people were talking about it. Yes, I work on a Sea Grant project in Vinyl Haven that's working on sustainable fisheries, and those cut off. By the way, only our Sea Grant in Maine was cut off. Nobody else in the country. What a coincidence. Only our Sea Grant in Maine was cut off. So yes, Jim, that's an example. Sea Grant, NIH. There are things going on that I don't yet fully realize the implications of. For example, the word this morning is 5,000 people are being fired at the Social Security Administration, and more to come. I don't know what that means. The Veterans Administration, they fired 2,400 people so far. With the hiring freeze, it's more like 5,000 reduction at the Veterans Administration. And they say, well, we're not going to affect direct care. My position is, if you're a veteran and are calling Togus to get an appointment and there's nobody to answer the phone, that's a denial of care. Just as if they locked the door in your face. So this idea that, some people are, direct care, I'm glad they're protecting direct care. By the way, at the very beginning, they didn't. When they put the hiring freeze into effect, it affected everybody, and only after the members of our committee squawked about that, they said, oh, no, we're going to just, doctors and nurses are okay. But the other cuts, it's hard to tell. 5,000 people at the Social Security Administration, thousands of people at the IRS. I just read this morning, they're closing something like 110 regional IRS service centers. Interestingly, I meet with my staff periodically, my staff in Maine. The IRS is the most helpful federal agency. That's surprising, isn't it? But because they've got really good people that are advocates, that try to help individual people with complicated tax problems. And they're apparently, I haven't verified this, but in the press this morning, 110 IRS field offices, which are basically taxpayer assistants, are going to be closed. That's going to impact people in Maine. And we don't know what's going to happen with Medicaid and with other of those programs. It's every single day is something new, but it is going to have very real impacts. And again, I don't want to be seen as saying nothing should change. We should never look at the federal workforce. We shouldn't look for efficiencies. Absolutely not. But we should do it in a thoughtful, systematic way. And to try to minimize damage and also maintain service to the American people. These are people providing services to our citizens, whether it's the IRS Taxpayer Assistance Office or the Department of Agriculture that helps Maine farmers with conservation programs. Those are valuable programs. But if they want to hit those gigantic targets for savings, as I pointed out, firing people isn't going to do it. They're going to have to start cutting some serious programs, and that's when I think people are going to see what the implications of this are.
The senator is on the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, and the young lady gave him a coin about his support for veterans. He's also been recognized as 2025 Legislator of the Year of the Disabled American Veterans.
One of the great honors of my life.
A well-deserved honor. So obviously the people in that community know they have a champion in the senator. So what about the Portsmouth shipyard? How high on that list is the administration to make substantial cuts?
Well, a couple things. The Portsmouth Naval Shipyard is a, and I'm not saying this because it's parochial. By the way, I keep having to point out to Gene Shaheen that the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard is in Maine.
Right. That's why I asked you.
But anyway, its mission is maintaining submarines. And submarines are an essential part of our national security deterrent. And therefore, it's a really important crown jewel in the system of keeping our ships at sea rather than at dry dock, and keeping our deterrent vital and real. In fact, there was a BRAC in 1995, and that's the closing bases. Remember that BRAC? That's how they closed Brunswick Naval Air Station. That's why I'll never vote for another BRAC. But anyway, they were going to close Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. Did a lot of analysis, decided absolutely not. It's a very important facility. And the people that work there are federal employees, civilians. It's run by the Navy, but the civilians work there. And for the last 2 or 3 years, they've been desperately trying to hire people. Hiring welders isn't easy. BIW is hiring. The skilled mechanical people are not easy to find. So they've been hiring about 100 people a month just to keep even, just to be able to meet the workload. And so we don't know yet whether it's a target. I've heard that they had the hiring freeze, and they are talking about firings there, but I can't imagine that they would do that, because the Naval Shipyard needs people in order to meet its mission of keeping our Navy intact and afloat. I mean, there would be no possible rationale for that, but one of the problems with the way this is being gone about, the firings, is that the people who are doing it literally don't know what they're doing. They're not people that are experienced in the government. They don't know the federal government. They're apparently people from California, young men mostly in their 20s. They didn't know that the National Nuclear Security Administration did important stuff with nuclear stockpiles, so they fired 20% of the workforce on the first day. And they said, oh, it's a mistake, we'll bring them back. But my point is and so I can't predict what they'll do, because they're doing things that are very, very damaging. But it shouldn't, I mean, it would be astounding to me if there were any serious cuts at Portsmouth.
I mean, you've spent some time on the Senate floor talking about the Constitution is into crisis, and we've usurped all our power to the executive. And are any of the colleagues on the other side listening and saying, you know what, we got to regroup and be a check and balance, and we got to seem to find ways of working together?
You mean do our job?
Yeah.
Yeah, our oath is it's a very simple oath, to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Isn't it interesting that the framers put the word domestic in that oath? That it wasn't just foreign enemies. They anticipated there might be domestic enemies of the Constitution. That's our job. So far, my colleagues on the Republican side, many of whom are good friends, just basically don't want to see this. They just don't want to, they just don't want to see it. Several of them have said to me, well, the courts will take care of this. Number one, that's a cop-out. It's our job. Number two, who knows which judge is going to say what. Number three, we now have the Vice President of the United States saying a federal judge doesn't have any right to tell the executive what powers they can exercise. And the president, a week ago, quoted Napoleon saying, if you're saving your country, you don't need to be bound by any law. Holy smoke. That's pretty scary. And so I don't think we can rely on the courts. I mean, the courts are stepping up in various ways, but what if the president says, I'm just not going to obey that order? Where are we then? So that's why I think the Congress and all the Congress, both parties, need to come together. And this is not a political issue. The constitutional separation of powers is not a partisan issue. It doesn't matter who the president is. This is a fundamental civics issue. And one of my friends said, well, Biden did unconstitutionally forgive student loans. That's not the same as destroying a statutorily created department. I said my response was, that's a fender bender compared to a 5-car head-on collision. Yes, presidents always try to take more power. That's been true throughout history. But you know what? My reading of history is usually Congress gives it up, which is what's going on now. The war power, for example, the Constitution is very interesting. In August of 1787, at the debates in the Constitutional Convention, there was quite a debate about the war power. August 23, 1787, and there were those who said the president, you can't have a committee controlling the war, so the president ought to have that power. And there were others who said, no, we don't want the president being like a king in Europe, starting wars on a whim and, that kind of thing. So they compromised and said the president is the commander-in-chief, but the Congress declares war. That was the division of power. Congress has expressly given to Congress in Article 1, Section 8, but they've delegated it to the president under emergency circumstances, but the president gets to define the emergency, and we end up with a tariff on Canada. So there's another case where Congress has essentially given away its power, and what we're in right now is whether Congress will give away its most fundamental power, which is the power of the purse. And that's sort of where we are now. The tariff on Canada is supposed to go into effect tomorrow. I still think it's going to be postponed again. It makes so little sense. It's going to be, talk about destructive to Maine.
Yeah.
The majority of lobster processing happens in Canada. So let's say Canada does a reciprocal 25% tariff, which they say they're going to do, of everything going that way. So lobsters going into Canada to be processed, 25% tariff. Coming back from the processors into the U.S., 25% tariff. That's going to be very damaging to our lobster industry. And wood circulates in northern Maine. Some goes from the U.S. into Canada, some comes from Canada in the U.S. By the way, it's almost exactly equal. I've seen the maps. The amount of Maine wood that goes into Canada is basically on geography. Where are the mills? And so that's going to be destructive. Here's one, though. Twin Rivers Paper in Madawaska, Maine. The pulp mill is across the river in New Brunswick. The wood comes into that mill, makes the pulp. They pump the pulp through a pipe across the river into Madawaska, where the paper is made. How the hell are you going to tax that? You see what I mean? We do $6 billion a year of trade with Canada. Our state. That's going to be terribly destructive, and yet this is a congressional power that Congress has basically abdicated.
The high cost of prescriptions is a challenge for all Americans. You filed a piece of legislation, which is bipartisan just recently, allowing Americans to purchase some medications in Canada. Talk about the bill, why you did it, the prospects of the bill being passed.
Why I did it, I was once on a plane going to Washington, and there was a fellow representing the pharmaceutical industry, and he said, "Why are you so mean to us?" or something like that. And I said, we just gotten off the plane, I said, because I feel like I'm the only guy on the plane paying full fare. Nobody in the world pays for drugs what we do. Drugs in Canada, many drugs in Canada cost 44% what they cost here. Just across the street, practically. And there was an argument, well, they're not safe, and Canada doesn't, take care of them. Their FDA isn't as good as ours used to be. But that's nonsense. It's the same drugs, same formula, same everything. So that's the idea, is basically to be able to take advantage of drug pricing. We pay more for drugs than anybody in the world. And the drug companies say, well, we need that money for research. guess what they pay for the advertising that you see on TV all the time? If that would pay for the research, there are only 2 countries in the world that allow direct-to-consumer drug advertising, the U.S. and I think New Zealand maybe. And that's a huge expense. So I think we've got to do whatever we can. The first bill I introduced when I got to Congress was to allow Medicare to negotiate bulk discounts for drugs. When the Medicare drug benefit passed under George W. Bush, there was a provision added that expressly forbade negotiation for drugs by Medicare. One of the guys that led that was a congressman from Louisiana who retired in the middle of the next Congress to be head of pharma. Isn't that a coincidence? So for years, it's been forbidden. Medicaid can negotiate volume discounts. The VA can negotiate volume discounts, but not Medicare. You all are in business. If you buy 100 widgets instead of 1, you generally want a better deal. We buy billions of dollars worth of drugs, and just the first set of negotiations under the Inflation Reduction Act, I think, has saved Medicare something like $6 billion a year and consumers $1 billion a year. So, I mean, we just have to get a handle on this. Otherwise, we're being taken advantage of vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And drugs are such an important. They're life-saving. Believe me, I take I take my statin in the morning, and So I'm not. I want research and everything else, but why are we paying more than anyone else in the world for the exact same drug? So that's
the Department of Energy nominee, Chris Wright.
Yep.
You supported his nomination,
did.
as well as Gene Shaheen and Maggie Haslett. What direction do you think he will take DOE?
Well, there are a number of the early nominees that I supported because I had interviewed him. I met with him in my office. Smart, reasonable guy. And then they turned around and gave Elon Musk the keys to their IT system and their personnel. And I didn't like it. So I'm much more suspicious now of the nominees. I haven't voted for many lately. As I say, he's a really smart guy. He's an oil and gas guy, but he understands climate change. He understands that there has to be a transition. He just thinks it's going to be longer than environmental folks want. But I have to say I was disappointed with what happened with the firing, particularly at the nuclear agency, because that's under the Department of Energy. Same thing with the Secretary of the Treasury, Bessent. I talked to him personally. He seemed like a reasonable guy. And then he was one of the first ones to turn over the keys to the Musk people in the Treasury. I got wise later on and voted against Tulsi Gabbard, Robert F. Kennedy, Kash Patel, a bunch of others, because they're not. They're not standing up for their agency. My standard for voting for or against cabinet nominees goes back to when I was governor. I think if you're the elected executive, you should sort of start with the premise that you could have the people around you that you know and trust. So my sort of starting point is yes, but I have two additional criteria. You can't be grossly unqualified or hostile to the mission of the agency to which you've been appointed. Those are my two standards, and that's what I've tried to apply as these nominees have gone forward. But this whole question of allowing this indiscriminate firing of your own staff strikes me as a kind of hostility to the mission. So I'm much more skeptical. I think there's one coming up today that I'm going to vote against this afternoon. So
Secretary of Education.
As my daughter would say, duh. And it's in the first Trump administration. I went back and looked. I voted for 75% of his nominees. So I'm not reflexively, because it's Trump. No, but I'm trying to take them one at a time. And I must say, I have been I have been disappointed with some of the folks that I have voted for. By the way, here I said it again. Something that's sort of not gotten as much attention as I think it should have. When they fired the top generals at the Pentagon, they also fired the top 3 lawyers, the judge advocate generals. That's ominous. Those are the people that tell the military what a legal order is and not. And if you saw my exchange with Mr. Hegseth during his nomination at the committee meeting, he basically said, I don't like the Geneva Convention. I'm not necessarily against torture, and I don't like lawyers that tie up the process that allow soldiers to do what they think they have to do. That's a dangerous moment. Military people are obliged to only follow legal orders, and the JAG officers, the senior military, are the ones that draw those lines. And the fact that they fired them that night, and the Inspector General, I found quite disturbing.
Just finally, tomorrow night is the State of the Union.
Yep.
And one of your colleagues from New England, Senator Chris Murphy, says he's not going. Are you going?
I've thought of not going, but I think I am going to go. What do you think? Should I go? Yeah, I think I should go. Yeah, I'm going to go. I think it's a matter of respect for the institution. I don't like State of the Unions generally. I think I skipped a couple of Joe Biden's because I don't like the performance aspect of it, where it's everybody's jumping up and down, and and all that cheer becomes like a high school pep rally. But even having said that, I plan to go. I won't even be on my phone.
Great. Well, we want to thank the senator. Gave us an hour, and the hour has come to an end. Very informative.
Thank you.
Get a picture. Get a picture.
Thanks very much.